Israel Keyes. So this guy Keyes was perhaps just a complete psychopath. He had this whole system for finding his victims. He would literally travel across multiple states, thousands of miles sometimes, just to find the perfect isolated locations and unsuspecting victims for his crimes. And unlike the others, the man was smart too, a former army guy who was apparently good at covering his tracks. But his final victim, he slipped up, was Samantha Koenig. This 18-year-old was just doing her job at a coffee stand in Anchorage when Keyes abducted her one night in early 2012. He then let her go to the bathroom while he watched, then eventually killed her. Then after that, he demanded $30,000 in ransom from her family even though Samantha was already dead. But he made the dumb decision to use her debit card. Of course, that created an electronic trail that led investigators straight to surveillance footage showing him using the card. He traveled all those miles, took all those precautions, and then his stupidity tripped him up. He was arrested in March 2012 outside of Loleta, California, and quickly confessed to the murder of Koenig, as well as admitting to planning and carrying out several other murders across the country over the previous decade. During his interviews with investigators, Keyes came across as smug and self-assured, almost boastful about the extent of his 16 murdered victims that they didn't even know about yet. The guy clearly got off on thinking he was a brilliant criminal mastermind. But in a final crazy twist, Keyes didn't even give the authorities a chance to prosecute him fully. In December 2012, less than a year after his arrest, he offed himself in his jail cell, hanged himself with a bedsheet. Anthony Garcia. Anthony was a former doctor fired from a job at a prestigious hospital in Omaha, Nebraska. Naturally, he was upset, maybe even harboring some anger towards your former colleagues. But instead of handling the situation like a rational adult, he decided to go on a path of vengeance that would make even the dumbest of criminals shake their heads. Garcia's first act was to tamper the luxury vehicle of one of the doctors who had a hand in his termination. Now, one might think that this would be enough to satisfy his need for petty revenge, but no. Garcia was just warming up. Over the next few years, Garcia planned and executed a series of 5 murders that targeted several doctors and their families, all because he couldn't let go of his grudge. Despite his supposed intelligence as a medical professional, Garcia left behind a trail of evidence. From using the same type of ammunition in each murder to leaving behind a distinctly patterned makeup compact at one of the crime scenes, Garcia might as well have left a neon sign pointing directly at himself saying, "It was me." In a move of craziness, Garcia decided to attend the funeral of one of his victims, essentially rubbing his crimes in the face of law enforcement and the grieving families. And sure enough, Garcia's dumb actions caught up with him. The mountain of evidence coupled with his attendance at the funeral led investigators straight to his doorstep. He was tried for first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Joel Rifkin. It's the early 1990s in New York, and a series of discoveries have law enforcement on high alert. Bodies, or rather dismembered remains, are being found in various locations around the city, each one more gruesome than the last. Now enter Joel Rifkin, a seemingly unassuming man with a dark secret. Let's say any rational person engaged in such acts would likely take extraordinary measures to cover their tracks, but Joel would leave a trail of breadcrumbs for the police to follow. Apparently, he didn't understand the concept of out of sight, out of mind. One of Rifkin's dumbest mistakes was his tendency to dispose of his victims' remains in public areas, often leaving behind crucial pieces of evidence that linked the crimes back to him. It's like he was saying, "Come and get me." However, the most stupid decision of all was Rifkin's choice of vehicle for transporting his victims' remains. Instead of opting for something unnoticeable, he decided to use his own pickup truck, complete with a personalized license plate that made it easily identifiable. It was like he was begging to be pulled over and caught red-handed. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. After one too many careless mistakes, the authorities zeroed in on Rifkin, ultimately catching him in the act with a dismembered body in the back of his truck. It must have been, at the very least, an awkward pullover. Rifkin admitted to committing 17 murders, and his confessions played a significant role in his conviction, leading to a 203-year prison sentence. Peter Goebbels. Think of this guy as the Nazi PR man during World War II. Peter Goebbels was the Minister of Propaganda for Nazi Germany during World War II. His role was to spread propaganda and disinformation to rally support for the Nazi regime and its policies. However, his actions were downright absurd, ineffective, and blindly loyal to a certain mustache man. To provide some context, let's look at the city of Dresden. It was a cultural and industrial center in eastern Germany, relatively undamaged by bombing until February 1945. The Allied forces carried out a series of air raids on Dresden, resulting in a firestorm that caused widespread destruction and a significant loss of civilian lives. In response to the bombings, Goebbels launched an extensive propaganda campaign portraying the attacks as a war crime and attempting to rally public support against the Allies. However, his efforts were mixed with extreme exaggerations and outright lies, showing how absurd and ineffective his propaganda could be. He claimed that the bombings had killed over 200,000 civilians, a figure that was later proven to be grossly inflated. As it became clear that Hitler's regime was collapsing, most sane people would have gotten their loved ones as far away from the impending storm as possible, but not Goebbels. No, the die-hard Kool-Aid drinker was so blinded by his devotion to Der Führer that he willingly sacrificed his wife and 6 innocent children to him. Goebbels, realizing the jig was up in Berlin, very calmly had his own personal doctor poison his kids with cyanide. It's not exactly a parenting decision that's going to win any Father of the Year awards. Then, because group slangs are apparently a family affair for the Goebbels clan, he and his wife happily munched down on some go-to-sleep-forever pills right after. The Monster of the Andes. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, this killer went on a cross-country murder spree that covered Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador of about 160 women and girls. His victims, mostly young girls, some as young as 8 years old, were lured in by his charm and subsequently subjected to acts of violence and assault. Clearly, he wasn't using his charm for good. Now, any sane person would likely practice caution when engaging in such insane acts, but not Pedro Lopez. No, this guy seemed to love his reputation, leaving a trail of bodies and clues in his wake. It's like he wanted to be a horror movie villain. One of Pedro's dumbest moves was his tendency to revisit the same areas where he had committed previous murders and raped them again, almost as if he was taunting the authorities and daring them to catch him, like he was playing a crazy game of cat and mouse with the lives of innocent children hanging in the balance. But perhaps the most foolish decision of all was Lopez's choice to confess to his crimes in detail, not just once, but multiple times. During his travels, he would openly boast about his kills to anyone who would listen, providing chilling accounts of his acts without an ounce of remorse or concern for the consequences. Unsurprisingly, this disregard for caution and common sense ultimately led to his capture. After one too many brazen confessions, the authorities finally pieced together the puzzle and tracked down the Monster of the Andes, bringing his reign of terror to an end, but only locking him up for 16 years. David Berkowitz. It's the summer of 1976 in New York City, and a series of seemingly random shootings have the entire city gripped in fear. The police are confused and the public is terrified, wondering when and where the next attack might occur. Enter David Berkowitz, a seemingly ordinary man with a very extraordinary delusion straight out of a horror movie. You see, Berkowitz was convinced that his neighbor's dog, yes, you heard that right, a dog, was possessed by demonic forces and ordering him to carry out these brutal murders. Over the course of a year, Berkowitz went on a killing spree, gunning down innocent victims in cold blood, all because he believed he was following the commands of a satanic dog. You can't make this stuff up. So you can imagine being on the jury and having to keep a straight face as Berkowitz launched into his story about taking killing orders from the zombie dog next door. "The dog from hell made me do it, I swear!" The crazy part is that after each attack, he would leave behind letters at the crime scenes, taunting the police and enjoying the chaos he had created. See, most savvy serial killers understand the importance of leaving as little a trail as possible, but not David. He decided to go to the complete opposite route by writing long-winded letters filled with deranged ramblings about demonic dogs and satanic influences compelling him to murder. But perhaps the dumbest move of all was Berkowitz's decision to park his car near one of the crime scenes, leaving it there for hours and essentially inviting the police to connect the dots. And sure enough, they did, eventually tracing the vehicle back to Berkowitz and bringing his reign of terror to an end. You'd think with such an outrageous excuse he might have gotten some leniency on the grounds of being certifiably insane. But no, the court saw through that madness nonsense and gave Berkowitz 25 years to life behind bars. But you never know, maybe it's true. The dog really was Beelzebub, and he really did want those people killed. Charles Ray Hatcher. In the early 1980s in Kansas City, Missouri, a string of brutal assaults and murders had the entire city on edge. The perpetrator is a remorseless killer who seems to strike randomly, leaving a trail of broken lives. The person behind it all was Charles Ray Hatcher, a man whose actions would guarantee his place among the dumbest criminals in history. Now, most savvy serial killers understand the importance of leaving as little evidence behind as possible. Hatcher took a much more, let's call it, artistic approach. One of Hatcher's dumbest mistakes was his tendency to steal personal items from his victims, often leaving them lying around in plain sight for law enforcement to discover. He was like a magpie, snatching up trinkets and leaving them scattered all over the crime scenes. Wallets here, jewelry there, it was as if he was leaving a trail of evidence behind for the cops to follow. Another decision that would lead to his arrest was Hatcher's choice to keep a trophy case of sorts filled with personal belongings and mementos from his victims. And sure enough, when the authorities finally heard of Hatcher's twisted trophy stash, the sheer amount of evidence he had carelessly left behind left little doubt as to his guilt. After a lengthy investigation, Hatcher was arrested in 1984. He was convicted on multiple accounts of murder and other charges. In the end, he was sentenced to multiple consecutive life sentences without parole. Ronald Post. Now, Ronald Post had grown tired of his marriage and decided the best course of action was to have his wife killed by a hitman. Most people would agree that hiring a professional killer is already a pretty dumb idea, but Post took the concept to new heights. Instead of being discreet or doing even the slightest bit of research, Post approached a man he thought was a hitman in a crowded shopping mall food court. Little did he know the man he was trying to hire was actually an undercover police officer, his first and last rookie mistake. So you can imagine the look on the undercover cop's face when this guy just casually strolls up and says, "Hey buddy, how much to take out my wife?" The officer probably thought he was being pranked at first. But no, Post was dead serious. No pun intended. He proceeded to lay out the details of how he wanted his wife killed, completely oblivious to the fact that he was essentially confessing to a crime right then and there. Post even offered to pay the hitman with a credit card, leaving a convenient paper trail for law enforcement. Needless to say, Post's plan to have his wife killed was stopped even before it really began right then and there. He was arrested and charged with solicitation of murder, all because he couldn't be bothered to do a basic background check on the hitman he hired. Now, unless there's a random statistic, a good number of serial killers were all born in November, and there's about one serial killer per 100,000 people. So, out of all our subscribers, if you join our Discord server, there's probably a probability that there could be one soon. Stephen Griffiths, crossbow cannibal. So apparently, Stephen Griffiths was a PhD student in criminology, which is already hilariously ironic. You'd think someone studying crime would know better than to commit crimes themselves, but that's exactly what this guy did. In 2010, Griffiths went on a killing spree in Bradford, England, murdering 3 sex workers quite literally using a crossbow. But it's not just the murders that earned him his nickname, Crossbow Cannibal. That would be too boring for Stephen. This guy had a taste for cannibalism, quite literally. After killing his victims, Griffiths dismembered their bodies and even ate parts of them. Griffiths was cocky enough to give himself the nickname and brag about his crimes in online forums, because nothing screams, "I'm a genius criminal mastermind," like publicly boasting about your gruesome deeds on the internet. When the police finally caught on to this guy, they didn't have to go through any elaborate sting operation or forensics operation to catch him. Griffiths practically gift-wrapped himself for them. During one of his online bragging sessions, he accidentally included details of all he had done to the victims that led the police straight to his door. In the end, the crossbow cannibal was sentenced to life in prison, where he can continue his criminology studies from behind bars with hands-on practice. Dennis Rader, BTK killer. Now let's start with Mr. Ordinary Family Man turned dumbest serial killer ever. Rader was a seemingly ordinary family man working as a compliance officer and living in Park City, Kansas. However, beneath his normal appearance was a serial killer who had been terrorizing the Wichita area for over 3 decades, carrying out a string of 6 murders between 1974 and 1991. Rader murdered 10 people, including men, women, and children, over this period. His victims were chosen randomly, and he carried out his crimes with planning and extreme brutality, often binding and torturing them before killing them. You see, this guy had a massive ego and an insatiable desire for attention and recognition. If you imagined his ego as a balloon, it'd be the size of a blimp, and every time he killed someone, it'd be like adding another puff of helium. The guy had been getting away with some seriously messed up stuff for over a decade, laying low like a proper serial killer should. But after 14 long years of keeping his mouth shut, Rader decided to reintroduce the BTK killer to the world in the most spectacularly dumb way possible. He sent a floppy disk filled with incriminating details about his crimes to a local news station. That floppy disk, which I'm sure Rader thought was totally anonymous, contained a digital trail that led straight back to a computer in the church where he served as president of the Congregation Council. Whoopsie daisy! As if basically handing the cops his home address wasn't dumb enough, egomaniac Rader went ahead and mailed a package to the police containing jewels from one of his unlucky victims. His hunger for fame and recognition as Wichita's most serial killer outweighed any idea of self-preservation instincts. In the end, Rader's craving to be the sickest celeb in town led police right to his door after over 3 decades of flying under the radar. After Rader's comical attempts at getting recognized for his crimes led police right to his doorstep, he was put on trial in 2005 for the BTK murders he had committed between 1974 to 1991 in the Wichita, Kansas area.